Hi, my name is Chip Hardwick. I'm the executive for the Synod of the Covenant, and I want to welcome you to this month's preaching workshop with the Reverend Dr. Aimee Moiso. I'm really grateful for each of you that are here live and also for everyone who will be watching later. This is such an important topic, thinking about preaching and conflict, and we pray and hope that it will help you in your preaching ministry. I've got several announcements before I turn it over to Aimee, and I'm going to share my screen and tell you some about what's going on in the life of the Synod. Let me see if I can get this. Here we go. Do you see that now? Yes, great. So I want to let you know that your congregations and other Presbyterian ministries are eligible to apply for a Matthew 25 grant. That's any ministry that you have that's working towards congregational vitality or against structural racism or systemic poverty. Any congregation or ministry within the Synod of the Covenant is eligible to apply, and they're up to $5,000 and they're due by September 30th. So I hope you'll apply. I also want to tell you about the Leaders Table. This is a cohort group looking at, in a world full of polarized politics, increasing technological change, and the decline of the mainline church, what's the best way for us to lead as Christian leaders? They're facilitated by missiologist Alan Roxborough, who has written, I think, like 17 books or something on the missional church and how do we reach our communities. It begins on September 13th. It's every 2 weeks, is a cohort that'll meet from 10 to 11:30 by Zoom. It's $50. And the Synod is paying the other $150 for the first 40 people who register. So if you register after that, you'll need to pay the full $200. Or maybe you can arm twist your presbytery into supporting you as well. But I hope you'll make time for that. That many of the presbytery leaders have gone through it, as I have, and I found it very helpful. We have a childhood sexual abuse prevention training on September 11th and the 14th in the evening by Zoom. LeaderWise is providing that. We're just about to announce our scholarship winners. So if you have students from your churches who have applied, let them know that we will we'll let everybody know within probably the next couple of weeks. And then next month for our preaching workshop, I'll be leading on exploring the themes of Advent 2023. It'll be we'll put the work into the workshop model. It'll be a lot of conversation looking at specific scriptures and learning together what we might do with Advent. And then in October, Cleo LaRue, who is just retiring from Princeton Seminary, he is so retiring that he hasn't even given me a topic yet, but he tells me he will soon. So that'll be in October. And then in November, we have Jerusha Neal, who will be talking about preaching about climate change. We would love to stay in touch with you. So the best way to hear from us about these and other ministries is to go to our newsletter, which you can subscribe to at synodofthecovenant.org/subscribe. You can also, of course, see our website, Facebook or YouTube channels. And here's my information. I would be glad to support you and your churches and your presbytery in any way I can. So I'd be glad to hear from you. Today, of course, we are excited because Aimee Moiso, the Reverend Dr. Aimee Moiso, is leading our conversation today. It's on standing in the breach, preaching and conflict. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about her background and how I know her. Aimee is the Associate Director of the Louisville Institute at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. She received her PhD in homiletics and liturgics from Vanderbilt and her MDiv from San Francisco Seminary. She and her husband, whom I know, Nolan Huizenga, are both Presbyterian pastors, and she enjoys gardening, baking, and creative reuse of old things. I have known Aimee since I worked on staff at the national office in 2012. That General Assembly was working on issues around marriage and civil unions. And Aimee, it was the most contentious thing in a very contentious time in the life of the church. And Aimee was the chair of that committee at a even younger age than she is now. And I was just amazed to watch her lead in that situation. With so much stress and so much difficulty, she just had a beautiful way of lowering the temperature in the room. And maybe that's one of the places where you got to put into practice what you are going to talk to us about today. The other way I've got to know Aimee is that she was the chair of the General Assembly Committee on Interfaith and Ecumenical Relations, which I was one of the staff support for when I was at the headquarters, and Aimee also did a beautiful job at that. So I'm very grateful, Aimee, to call you a friend and colleague, and I'm really excited to have a chance for you to share. As I mentioned before all of you got on, I need to go to another meeting, but I look forward to watching this afterwards. And I have told Aimee that all of you are going to be very, very kind to her in my absence. So I'll leave it over to you all. Aimee, thank you very much. Let's give her some happy hands and welcome her to the Synod preaching workshop. Thank you, Aimee.
Thanks, Chip. Can you all hear me okay? Great. Well, thank you for that warm welcome. You all are welcome to be kind to me, and also it's about conflict. So with conflict, theoretically, this is part of the whole thing, right? So that makes it easier on my end, right? If things go awry, I just say, oh, that was all part of the plan. It's on conflict, so it's fine. Anyway, great to have you all here. I think that if other people are able to get through the passcode issue or whatever, they'll be able to jump in as we go. So I have a whole presentation, and it has a lot of information in it. So we're going to see how much we can get through and where we need to stop and just have conversation along the way and just sort of flow through it together. So I'm glad to have you all here. Thank you for being here. There are a couple times when I might ask you to just reflect a little bit. So if you have paper in front of you, that could be helpful. I'm assuming you all have some way to take notes anyway. Otherwise, why would you be here? So thank you all for being here. Glad to be with you this morning. So let me just share my screen and we'll get started. All right. You should all be seeing something that is red and pink. Is that correct? Good. All right. So as Chip said, I have done a bunch of different kinds of things related to conflict, including that chairing that GA committee. I've also done a lot of work in the ecumenical movement. So a lot of my background is related to how do churches talk to each other across difference and across history. And so all of these pieces all feed into this interest that I have about conflict and preaching. So I did my PhD at Vanderbilt in preaching and homiletics, but it was really focused on how are we communicating about things that are hard. And it took me down this track of thinking about what do we even believe about conflict theologically? What are we thinking about when we think about conflict in the church? And so we're going to start there this morning, thinking about what conflict looks like. So here's a little outline of where we're going. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about our hidden and not so hidden beliefs about conflict and why we hold them. This is something I learned when doing my PhD, that I had these sort of embedded ideas about what conflict was in relation to my faith, and I had never really thought about it before. So we're going to start there. We're going to talk a little bit about conflict in the Bible. Since this is a preaching workshop, we want to think a little bit about the Bible. We're going to redefine and rethink what conflict can be. And then at the end, we'll get to some real specifics around preaching and conflict. So it may feel like it's going to be a while before we get to the preaching question, but it's all building up to that. So roll with me as we go along. I want to start with just giving us a sense, a moment of thinking about what God's hope for the world is when it comes to conflict. So I think for the most part, we have an idea in our mind that God's hope for the world is reconciliation, is peace, people living together in some kind of harmony. We have lots of biblical texts about this. So this is not a strange thing to imagine is what God has in mind, right? So we start from this idea that God's hope for the world is a place of peace, of reconciliation, of interdependence, of equality and justice, all those kinds of things. So that's our baseline space, is God's hope for the world. And from there, it makes sense then that when we think of conflict, we think of that as being sort of against that reconciled space, right? So the kinds of things we think of when we think of conflict are arguing or yelling or fighting. This particular picture, I think, is supposed to be Barnabas and Paul boxing over some disagreement. And then we think about violence, right, and warfare. So conflict becomes this huge idea of all the things that are broken, all the things that are wrong. And within the church, we've sort of then adopted this idea that conflict equals bad. So whether you all have a big screen in front of you or not, I'll describe what's on your screen. There's a little cartoon, and there's these two girls, and the first one says, "My family's more Christian than yours," and the second one says, "Is not." And the first one says, "Is to," "Is not," "Is to." They're fighting about which family is more Christian, right? Not to belabor a joke and explain it, which ruins the joke, but we all think this is funny because we know that Christians aren't supposed to fight, right? That's what makes the cartoon funny, is that assumption. So at the baseline, Christians tend to believe that conflict is a sin for all these reasons, right? For all these sort of assumed reasons, right? We haven't really even talked about it that deeply necessarily, but that's sort of where we land. So why do we believe this? Well, the Bible is one place, right? We have a lot of texts in the Bible, and we have this vision of God's reconciled world. We have Jesus talking about peacemaking. We have Isaiah talking about the end of warfare and swords into plowshares. We have Paul talking about living at peace with all people and putting aside enmity. So we have biblical texts that make us think that conflict is something bad and peacemaking is something good. But the other piece of this that we don't think about as often is that conflict feels bad, right? No one out there, I think, really loves conflict. They might think they do, but it's for other reasons, right? No one is like, "Yay, conflict, it's the best. It makes me feel great," right? We are made to be connected to each other, and we fear disconnection, right? So when we're in conflict, that anxiety when somebody responds to you in a way that you're not expecting, and it feels like conflict, and you kind of have that immediate feeling of like, "Oh, wait, where are we? What's happening right now?" Because that wasn't what I was expecting. And we feel this disconnection. And we're afraid of where it's going to lead, somebody being left out, feel people being separated from each other. And conflict threatens that connection, right? So conflict is a threat to our connection with each other. And that's part of why it feels bad. That's sort of the more theological reason. If we're made to be connected to each other, if God has this idea of interdependence and interconnection, then threats to that feel bad. They feel bad to us. There are other reasons why conflict feels bad, right? It evokes a lot of emotions that do not feel great, right? So in addition to things like confusion, we also have fear, we have loneliness, we have resistance, we have anxiety, we have anger. It brings up suspicion. We don't know what's happening in the moment, and it makes us feel unstable, right? So there's a lot of emotion that comes with it. And we tend to believe that things that feel bad are bad, right? There's good reasons for this, right? If you eat something that's not good for you, like something poisonous, right? And you feel bad, your body's saying, "Don't eat that anymore." Like, it's not good for you. Things that are bad, that feel bad, tend to be bad. And we associate that with conflict emotionally. So this is part of the dynamic at play, is because things don't feel good, we think they're bad, and therefore conflict fits into that box. These are generalizations, but I hope you'll just roll with me. All right. So to sum up, unity and agreement is good. Conflict, disagreement, bad. These are the things that we have sort of learned in the church and in a lot of our places of community in general, in school, in other places, right? This is sort of our general framework that most of us have grown up with. So when we believe that conflict is bad or a sin, there's some things that happen, right? So one is that we're more likely to avoid it or to push it aside. Something bad, we want it to go over here, we want it to go away, we want to avoid it, we don't want to see it, we don't want to hear it, we don't want to address it. We want to fix it really fast, find the quickest answer. How can we get past this conflict and get back to peace? How can we get back to that status quo of everybody getting along? Because we want to fix it quickly. So sometimes we also paper over it. We pretend like it's fixed when it's not fixed, or hide it behind things. And I think at some deep level, we know that it's not easy to fix. So we want to rush ahead because we know it's going to be hard to deal with some conflicts. So this is sort of a consequence of our sense that conflict is bad. And there's another tendency, especially in the church, but anywhere in which we have strong convictions, which is in the setting of conflict, we can come to a place of just wanting to win the argument or win the battle of whatever we're working on, because we have the truth and the other person does not have the truth. And I don't want to slide over this really quickly, because this is a really important theological point. In conflict situations, when you have a deep held conviction, it's even harder to not get polarized from the other person, because the more you are confronted with some other kind of perspective, the harder it is for you to let go of your truth, because it is so deeply embedded in who you are. So it's calling into question things that are intrinsic to you and what you believe about the world. And in the church, we do this all the time, right? When you get up to preach, you have something to say, right? That theoretically you believe. I hope you believe it, right? And so how in those moments are we attending to that balance between addressing the conflict and just wanting to win because we have the truth? I don't have time, unfortunately, to go deeper into this particular issue today, but it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. Where's that balance for you between holding on to something that you believe to be true and bearing witness to what other people hold as true in these spaces where we're actually called to speak truth, right? So it's just it's a real dynamic in the mix, but it does lead to more polarization rather than more understanding when we're just trying to win. All right. So to sum up, as I've been talking about all this, I want you to take a moment and think about who or what has been on your mind, because the bottom line here is conflict is never abstract, right? Like I gave you a bunch of abstract things, but for sure, something's in your mind, some situation, some person, something you've experienced in the past, your family, your colleagues, your spouse, your children, whatever, something is probably on your mind. So the point of this moment is for you to just take a second and like, just note those in your mind. You can write them down if you want to, just like these realities of conflict are never abstract. They always come back to the concrete. And that's one of the things that makes this so difficult to talk about, because we're talking about real relationships and real people in our lives. And we can't just sort of make blanket statements about what conflict should be or is or shouldn't be, because it's real, it's intimate, it's with people that you know and care about. So pause there. I'm going to give you just a second if you want to write down any thoughts that you have thus far. We'll have some time for conversation and questions going forward, but this is a good moment to just sort of pause and let you reflect on what you've heard so far. I'll just give you like 30 seconds before I go on to the next thing for you to just think, okay, conflict, bad, unity and peace, good. The different ways in which you might have thought about conflict in your own life and what you've been taught by the church. So I'll just give you a few seconds to just sort of think about that on your own. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about conflict in the Bible. So I gave you a few, this is all very cursory, like quick stuff for you, because I want you to have some tools to move forward with, especially in your preaching. But all of this can go a lot deeper. So feel free to note things that you have questions about. We'll come back to it at the end so that if there are things that you want to go deeper with, we can. But I want to take a moment and just think about conflict in the Bible in some different ways. I gave you some scriptures already, just brief ones, those ones about blessed are the peacemakers and neither shall they learn war anymore, those kinds of things. We're used to those when we think about conflict, but I want to offer you some other ideas to think about when you think about conflict. So this is from Ephesians. Therefore, after you've gotten rid of lying, each of you must tell the truth to your neighbor, because we are parts of each other in the same body. Be angry without sinning. Do not let the sun set on your anger. Don't let any foul words come out of your mouth. Only say what is helpful when it is needed for the building up of the community, so that it benefits those who hear what you say. So I don't think I've ever heard a sermon on be angry without sinning. Maybe some of you have preached on it before. I would like to hear a sermon on that. What an interesting idea to engage the idea of telling the truth, even in anger, but without sinning, and to not let the sun go down on your anger. This is a verse about conflict that we don't always get a chance to address in our churches, and to take as maybe a core way of thinking about conflict. So that's one to keep in mind, Ephesians 4. Another one is Luke 18, 3-4. This is the persistent widow. So in the city, there was a widow who kept coming to the judge and saying, grant me justice against my opponent. For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming. So here we have an example of a woman causing conflict, right? This is a woman who is demanding justice and is causing conflict in the process. So here we see an example of the kind of conflict that might be necessary to make change, right? The kinds of things that might be worth pursuing because the system as it is not working, right? And so we need to do something different and pursue something different to make change. So here's a different version of conflict in the Bible and what it might mean. And then James 4, another interesting text from James. What is the source of conflict among you? What is the source of your disputes? Don't they come from your cravings that are at war in your own lives? You long for something you don't have, so you commit murder. You don't have because you don't ask. You ask and don't have because you ask with evil intentions to waste it on your own cravings. So here we have a perspective on conflict where the motivations behind conflict are the problem, right? So it's not that conflict itself is bad, but where it's coming from is the problem. And it's the motivations underneath it, the desires that are not appropriate, the desires that are not of God, that become the reason why conflict is a problem. So if we look at these and we think about conflict in the Bible, there's a few things that can help us when we're looking at texts, right? So first of all, in the Bible, conflict refers to all kinds of relational encounters, right? So different Greek and Hebrew words for things like contention, dispute, quarrel, and violence often get translated as conflict. So when you're looking at a text and conflict comes up, you might just consider what's the word here that's being translated as conflict. There may be a variety of things underneath it that are not as clear as might appear just from the English translation. The second one is that context matters, right? So texts in the epistles are often written to communities that are already in conflict. And so they specifically emphasize cohesion, community cohesion, right? That's the intention of those letters because of the context into which they're written. That doesn't mean every context is the same. So Jesus doesn't speak unilaterally against conflict. Jesus recognizes that conflict is part of daily life. It's something that's going to happen. He names a bunch of times the kinds of conflicts that are coming up among the people around him, and that conflict can be necessary for transformation and change, right? This is a whole piece of Jesus' ministry, is saying we can't let things just be the same. We can't just sit aside and pretend like all is well. These things need to be changed, and conflict is involved to make that change happen. So we've got two different kinds of contexts, two different kinds of ways that the scripture is speaking to different kinds of people about conflict. And then finally, the cause matters, right? So conflicts born out of self-serving impulses, lies, pettiness, false teaching, that's not cool, right? That's not what God is about. Those kinds of teachings are rejected. Those kinds of sources of conflict are rejected as legitimate conflict. But challenging injustice can prompt necessary change. Challenging things that are not okay is conflict that is endorsed by the Bible, right? It may not be done so by violence, although there are times for that in the Bible too. That's a different lecture. But there is a sense that conflict itself is not one thing. Conflict itself is not sin. It is not necessarily bad. It has different purposes and it has different ways of being. All right. So we come back to this. We're going to shift a little of our perspective from unity and agreement equals good and conflict and disagreement equals bad, that visual that we had to begin with. We're going to go over here. In a world of differences where no two people are the same, conflict's unavoidable. It just is. It just is. And it's normal and natural. Conflict is just what happens when you get people together who are different. In fact, in conflict theory, this is the sort of base definition of what conflict is. Conflict is tension that results when we encounter difference. Conflict is tension that results when we encounter difference. So that sense of when you go somewhere new and you don't really feel like something's bad or good, but it's really different, so you're kind of unstable, that's the tension we're talking about. It can be as simple as this. my favorite movie starts at 6 and 8, and your favorite movie starts at 6:30 and 8:30. I almost changed this so it said Barbie and Oppenheimer on here, but I decided not to because I want this to be a more timeless kind of presentation. But this is a conflict, right? You want to go to one movie, I want to go to another movie. It's just natural. We have different interests. This is just part of life, right? Another would be, you're used to chopsticks and I'm used to fork, knife, and spoon. And I don't know how to use chopsticks and you don't know how to use a fork, knife, and spoon. And it's just different, right? There's nothing sinful about the fact that we don't know this other thing, that we aren't familiar with it, that it's just different. But it causes tension in us. It causes us to feel that kind of anxiety. So part of what conflict theorists tell us is we got to kind of wrestle with that reality and become more comfortable with the discomfort, right? It just is. These things just are, okay? The other piece of this is theologically, we talk all the time about the importance of diversity. We believe difference and diversity are good. We believe they are gifts of God. We talk about it all the time, right? So when we say difference is good and then we say conflict is bad, it's sort of a mixed message for our congregations and the people that we work with. So how can we say this in different ways? How can we look at this through different lenses where we can simultaneously say difference is good and conflict is, it just is, it exists. And so how do we do it well, right? What does good conflict look like? And that's where we're going to go next. So first, what we believe about conflict matters. If we're sitting in a place where we think all conflict is a sign that something has gone awry, right? That all conflict is a sign that we're not going to be able to move forward with God's plan until we solve our conflict and come to a place of peace because it's against God's will to be in conflict, that's going to take us in a different direction than if we can sit together and say, okay, we're having conflict. This is natural. What do we do about it? So the belief matters, right? And then how we respond matters. How we respond to conflict matters. Some people are better at responding to conflict than others. Some people are really conflict avoidant and they don't like it. That's okay. In this particular setting, it's not important that you are more able to engage with conflict or not. We're going to talk about what the categories of sort of constructive and destructive conflict look like, and anybody can engage in those. All right. So this is a quote from a Mennonite scholar who's done a lot of work in conflict. She says, our ability to work through conflict successfully has much to do with the attitude we bring to it. How we view and feel about the self, the other, conflict, truth, and even God often determines how we work with conflict. This is kind of a summary of where we've gotten to so far. So remember, we started with what have we learned? What have we absorbed about what conflict is and what God wants? Where are some of the places that those things come from? The emotions that get aroused with conflict, the things that we believe about God's reconciling of the world, how we have maybe come to believe that conflict is sin and how we might think about it differently, the ways in which we can see a variety of approaches to conflict in Scripture. These things actually matter because they help direct us toward different responses to conflict. So thinking about what those responses could and should be matters a lot. And that's what this quote is trying to point at. What is the attitude we're going to bring to this? What are the beliefs we're going to bring to this? How are we going to attend to those attitudes and beliefs when confronting conflict? All right. So conflict has the potential to be constructive or destructive, right? This was a new idea for me when I was working on my dissertation. I didn't know it was, once I learned it, I thought, oh yeah, that makes total sense. But I had never thought about it that way, right? We think about resolving conflict and getting rid of conflict and getting past conflict, but we don't really talk as much about the positive sides of conflict or how conflict can be useful. So here are some markers. Constructive conflict tends to be oriented toward growth, honesty, discovery, change, and repair. So we're thinking about conflict that you've had with a spouse or a partner or a good friend, where after the conflict, you grew, right? You learned something about yourself or them that made you see things in a different way, in a good way. That you dug down together with someone else in a conflict and you got to a deeper level of honesty together where you were really sharing at a deeper level your own sense of self, or you learned something, or something got changed out of it, or you were able to repair something that wasn't going well. Someone came to you and said, this system isn't working for me, and you were able to work with the system to change the system to make it work better, right? These are the kinds of conflicts that are constructive, and orientations that are constructive. Destructive conflicts are things that lead to rigidity, to sort of entrenched positions, to polarization, which is really, we use this word a lot in politics right now, but in conflict theory, it's very much that sort of separation of people from each other, where there's a big gulf in between, and you're not allowed to be in that middle section anymore. You have to choose a side, and the sides get farther and farther apart. That's what polarization is. And destructive conflict pushes more and more toward those ends, right? Toward the two sides that are so distant from each other, there seems to be no common ground, right? Injustice comes out of destructive conflict, violence, of course, warfare, those kinds of things. And then enemies, I have that in quotes here, because enemies is when we get to the point of thinking of another person as no longer a person, right? They're merely an enemy. And of course, the enemy also becomes a whole group of people, right? So think about how we have in the past talked as Americans about terrorists, right? Not terrorism, but terrorists. They themselves are something not human. They are just a group of people who have done horrible things, and therefore they are our enemies. That kind of blanket overview of a group of people is what I'm talking about when I say enemies. And that emerges out of destructive conflict. And it's when we lose the attention to the human in the other person. So when we're in conflict with others, we have some opportunities to make choices in response that can lead more toward constructive or destructive orientations. There are a ton of books about this kind of stuff. If you want more background on how to do this well, or how to have these conversations in congregations or other groups, I can recommend some books, but here's just a sort of a quick overview of the kinds of orientations that constructive and destructive conflict take. So when we're in conflict with others, we can choose to make space for curiosity. If anybody's watched Ted Lasso, this is a big thing in Ted Lasso. He exhibits curiosity about what's going on in a situation, or what's going on in the other person, that allows him to take a step back from what could be destructive conflict. Not that he's some kind of, superhero, he has his own issues, but that's an example of how curiosity works. We can choose to make space for humility. I know that when someone challenges me, my response is defensiveness, because I'm being challenged on something that I hold dear, or that I thought was true. And so sometimes I have to take a step back and be like, okay, maybe I don't have all the information. I'm going to take a moment to be humble about this. Of course, we can choose to make space for listening. And actually taking a moment to hear what the other person is saying at a deeper level, to be open to where they're coming from. This doesn't mean agreeing. This doesn't mean you have to take what they're saying as truth. It means just being open to hearing what they're saying and where they're coming from. Compassion, that understanding of where someone might have come to their beliefs, right? Or might have come to the position that they're standing in. Again, doesn't mean you have to accept it, doesn't mean you have to agree with it. It's that space of leaving open the relationship, of maintaining the humanness of the other person by showing compassion. And then vulnerability, that we can ourselves admit that we might be wrong, that we can ourselves stand sort of gently and hold gently the truths that we have carried, with the opportunity to be vulnerable and think about whether or not we could let them go or respond to them differently. And then imagination. One of the challenges when we're getting to a polarized space is that we can't imagine third ways. There's way one and way two, and there's no third way. So imagination becomes really key in working through conflict, where we can take a break and say, okay, hang on, let's think about other options that we haven't considered. Where could our imagination take us to get through this, or to talk through this more fully? All right, so things that lead more toward destructive, that we want to resist, are immediate judgments. That can happen even before the conflict starts. Somebody comes in your office who's been a problem child for you before, you just know, like, oh gosh, they're going to bring me something else that I have to deal with. I'm sure none of you have ever had this happen. And so before they walk in the room, you've already sort of made a judgment about what this interaction is going to be like. So just taking a pause, try not to judge ahead of time. You can resist the desire to avoid. Avoidance just puts it off. Conflict doesn't go away because you avoid it. It tends to just get worse. I do not like that. I would like to be able to avoid things, but it's the case. Defensiveness, of course, sort of the flip side of things like humility and listening. Hostility is related to defensiveness, so sort of not maintaining an open posture to hear what's going on. There's a difference between setting boundaries or saying, we're going to stop talking about this right now because I need to think about it, or we need to take a break, and being hostile about it, which is a much more aggressive kind of approach. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about where to set boundaries and things like that. But know that none of these things are saying that you have to just sit and take abuse, or you have to just receive something terrible happening. But hostility is a different kind of orientation because it has an aggressive side. And of course, these are also responses that are choices we can make about how to respond, but they aren't necessarily how we feel, right? So you don't have to feel compassionate to respond with compassion. You could still be angry inside and respond with humility. So it's helpful sometimes to keep these things separate from each other, how you're actually feeling in the moment from how you're going to choose to respond to the moment. All right, so othering is the same as enemies. Sort of writing people off, or in the worst cases, thinking that they're just not human or not worthy. We see this a lot in the political system right now. I hear language all the time that just blanketly dismisses a whole group of people as if they're not worth listening to. I mean, I saw a bumper sticker the other day that said, oh shoot, now I forgot the first half of it, but it was like, I'd rather be an American than a Democrat or something like that. And it was like this sort of blanket dismissal of a whole group of people, right? That's all, anybody who identifies this way is terrible. Therefore, we can do it on the liberal side too. Anybody who is not supporting Black Lives Matter or who is not woke enough, right? They're just not worth it. They're not worth our time. We just need to dismiss them and move on. That's the othering. Again, these are postures. These are ways of responding to conflict. They're not the same as how you feel. They're not the same as your deepest convictions about what you think is right. They're how are we going to respond in the midst of conflict? We can resist the rush to disconnection. That's different than taking time away, but disconnecting and just being like, I'm just going to sit here and be on my phone and not paying attention to what's going on. That's not as helpful. And then critique, jumping to a critique of the other person's argument is something we can resist in order to cultivate vulnerability, compassion, openness. All right, so here's sort of the bottom line of how to think about this in your congregations, in wherever you're working, and in your preaching. Instead of asking, how do we resolve this conflict or disagreement? What if we asked, what kind of relationship do we want to have? What kind of relationship do we want this to be, right? People with whom we work aren't going anywhere, unfortunately. Sometimes we're in a situation where we're going to have to work with somebody who we don't like. We're going to have people in our congregations who are frustrating. So we can talk about what kind of relationship do we want to have instead. So here's what I'm talking about. So if you're in a situation of conflict, a way to sometimes get deeper and into and through the conflict more fully is to think together about the qualities you want in the relationship together. So obvious ones are things like love, empathy, openness, truth-telling, forgiveness, listening, reserving judgment. Some of these you've just heard already: honesty, willingness to change, safety, and compassion. So the idea here is, are there ways when you're in a situation of conflict when these kinds of things could be starting points for conversation? So you're in a conflict with, I don't know, say you're in a committee meeting and there's conflict in the committee and people are getting to these accusatory, defensive postures, right? So one thing that can be done in those situations is say, okay, let's pause for a second, because this kind of conflict is messing with the relationships that we want to have, right? It's causing us to be farther away from each other as people, not just in the conflict, but as people. We're seeing each other in these more negative ways. So can we all agree that what we want to have in this relationship is the ability to tell the truth and to be honest, but also to be compassionate toward each other? And is that then a way to have a conversation together where you can come to agreement on the nature of the relationship that then allows for the conversation and the conflict to progress. Does that make sense? You guys are with me? I can only see like 3 of your faces on my Zoom screen. So, all right. So that is basically an orientation toward thinking about conflict. And that's the sort of overview of it. Now here comes the boundaries. So are all differences of opinion equally good or acceptable? Like, for example, do you want to give equal opportunity to white supremacists in your congregation? Can you resist people who don't treat you with respect? Especially if you're a person in a minoritized group, do you have to stand there and take it when somebody's saying something hateful about who you are, right? Are all conspiracy theories just healthy differences of opinion, right? Where are sort of the boundaries around dealing with difference and acknowledging difference and accepting difference? As I said before, conflicts are all very specific, so there aren't too many blanket things to say, but here's one that it can be helpful. Not all differences are worthy of our time and attention, and some should immediately be resisted. And they tend to be the ones that cause harm. So it is always right and faithful to resist things that cause harm. So if you're in a scenario where there's conflict happening and there's harm happening, somebody's getting yelled at in a way that's inappropriate, somebody's getting called things that are inappropriate, the tensions are so high that there's not any productive conversation, it's okay to resist things that cause harm. And it's also okay to name those things in your sermons, right? Just because you want to speak about differences of opinion or talk about conflicts in open ways in sermons doesn't mean you have to give everybody equal weight, because some things are harmful. The trick, of course, is that people also disagree about what the things are that cause harm. And that's also a different lecture. So again, this is contextual to your situation. You'll have to assess in your own context as a pastor, as a leader, what is causing harm where you are. Like what are the highest needs for protection of those who are most vulnerable in your context. And then from there, you can determine what needs to be resisted, what needs to be cut off, what needs to be stopped. All right. A couple more things that we're going to shift to the preaching side. I'll pause at the end of this before we go into preaching and see if there are questions. Just to refresh. These are the qualities of constructive conflict. Promotes connection between people rather than polarization. How are we understanding and learning about each other? It increases justice, equality, and right relationship, right? So issues are brought to the table that need to be addressed because of injustice or inequality, or because the relationships are imbalanced and unbalanced in some way or destructive in some way. Constructive conflict increases justice, equality, and right relationship. Constructive conflict leads toward discovery and understanding. When we come out of constructive conflict, even if it's been hard, we have a different set of understandings for ourselves. We've discovered new things, and it has promoted growth in us. It builds empowerment for all the people involved, because in the end, theoretically, everybody in constructive conflict has a chance to talk about what matters to them and why. And they all feel more solid in their own sense of what they're about, right? Even if they don't come to agreement, they maybe are in a place of understanding better how they got to the belief that they hold. And encourages recognition of the other, right? As opposed to pushing them away. You see them, you understand them. Again, not equated with agreement, just equated with recognition of seeing the other, of understanding, of listening to the other. Now, here's the kicker. Constructive conflict requires willing participants. This is not going to work for everybody. Some people are not going to want to do that. They're going to have their own agenda. They're going to want to push forward their desires, come hell or high water, right? So this is the real tricky part, is that cultivating relationship through constructive conflict requires participants who want to be there and who are willing to participate. And that in turn is a culture shift for a lot of places. So this can take a long time to have it get implemented in healthy ways. If you have a congregation or a setting where people are used to butting heads all the time and that's how things get done, then you're not going to necessarily have willing participants at first. And you're going to have to think through, how do I bring people around to seeing how conflict is destructive or constructive, and then helping people come to a willing place. It focuses at the bottom line on strengthening the relationship itself, right? So rather than resolving the conflict, what we're really talking about here is how can constructive conflict increase our abilities to be in relationship with each other in honest ways, in truthful ways, in hopeful ways, in ways that grow us together, right? This is sort of the theological basis of this, that as members of the body of Christ, we have things to learn from each other, and that we're better together, we're stronger together, we're something different when we're together in the body of Christ. And so the relationship itself really, really matters. And sometimes it matters more than winning. Sometimes it matters more than resolution, to just make sure that we're still in relationship with each other in healthy ways. Okay, good so far? Okay, we're gonna switch over to preaching, but I'm gonna pause here for just a second. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can see you all and see if there are any questions or thoughts on that so far. All right, now I can see you all. That was a lot that I went through really fast, so it's fine if you're processing. But feel free to ask any questions or put them in the chat if you like. Or we can move on. Y'all are totally with me or you're totally not with me, but either way, we're going to move on because I'm not seeing any questions. So we'll keep going. All right, cool. So let me go back to here. All right. Oops, that's not what I want. There we go. Hang on, let me do that again. There we go. All right. So what about preaching? What does all this have to do with preaching? You guys are seeing a screen that says, what about preaching, right? Okay, good. All right. So if you think back to, for those of you who have an MDiv, I'm not going to assume everybody does, but if you do, if you think back to your preaching class, which I assume most of you had to take, you may think about different models of preaching that you had in preaching class. And two of them that tend to come up in thinking about preaching in times of conflict are prophetic preaching and pastoral preaching. You may remember like this may be sort of pulling back from in your brain from way back when you had your MDiv. So we're going to start with thinking about what those two models have taught us about preaching in conflict, and then what other models might be available to us. So for starters, prophetic preaching, there's some stereotypes about it, right? So I just Googled like preaching and preachers and like immediately came up with these images. There's a little statue that we have somewhere, and I meant to bring it up here. Somebody gave us this wood carving of a preacher, I guess because I was getting a PhD in homiletics, and they were like, oh, they will want this. I'm sure all of you have things like this in your office too. And the preacher is like wagging his finger, you know, it's a guy in a suit. Anyway, these are sort of our stereotypes of what prophetic preaching is, right? Somebody's going to get up in front of us and they're going to yell at us about things that are wrong, that we're doing wrong, that are wrong with the world, whatever. I particularly like the blue furry monster myself. It's sort of like a Muppet prophet preacher. So the reality of prophetic preaching in the actual homiletical literature is a little bit different. Prophetic preaching tends to be preaching that is making clear statements of truth or what's right or wrong, right? So it's responding to a situation and saying, this is not okay, or this needs to go a different direction. And it tends to be prioritizing justice for those who are oppressed, right? So prophetic preaching is almost always focused on the needs of those who've been oppressed in some way. It generally echoes the biblical prophetic witness, as we all know. This is where a lot of these ideas about what prophetic preaching should look like come from, right? The prophets are not very nice. They do not sort of say things in nice, kind ways. They tend to be pretty destructive, conflict oriented, I might say. But these are the sort of trajectories of prophetic preaching over time. And they pronounce God's judgment, right? So the prophets are always saying, because this is happening, God's not happy, right? So the model of prophetic preaching, if you want to sort of give it a frame as you're thinking about what prophetic preaching is the preacher as a judge or arbiter, right? The preacher is making a proclamation about right and wrong and is arbitrating some situation. And I just want to say, these are just models. These are not, I'm not going to at the end say these are bad, you should throw them out. They're just different models. So there are times in which this is the right model, and there are times when it might not be the right model. But this is one of the models that we tend to be given when we're thinking about conflict, right? It's prophetic preaching. You got to get up there and just speak the truth. Take a side, say what's right and wrong, and speak the truth. So that's prophetic preaching. So pastoral preaching, if you recall, some of those stereotypes are more like, let's all just get along, pastor as therapist, sermon as therapy, sermon as counseling, sermon as making everybody feel good, sermon as papering over all the problems and giving you just that warm, fuzzy feeling in your heart so that you can go about your day. Those are the stereotypes of what pastoral preaching is. And again, something that might be used in conflict, right? You've got conflict, you're just going to make everybody feel better, just going to heal the room and make everyone tell a nice story at the end that might bring a tear to people's eyes so you could just move past the conflict and go on. Well, here's the reality of pastoral preaching. It is focused on the care of the heart, mind, and soul, right? It's not just about the intellectual doctrine related to justification or something, but it has a more holistic approach to the whole of the human person, including emotions. The focus is typically on God's grace and purpose in a hearer's life. So in the midst of something they might be struggling with, where are we finding God's will? Where are we finding God's purpose? It's attentive to personal concerns. In the history of 20th century preaching, pastoral preaching came out as an orientation for preaching that was really meant to address the real lives of people in the pews and not sort of stay up at the 20,000 foot level to try and help identify in their own lives where God was moving, what was going on with God in their lives, and therefore was attentive to their personal concerns, which is where we get sort of the counseling overlap with preaching. And it fosters a caring community, right? The attention to the pastoral needs of the congregation in preaching helps us think about what are the needs of the people around us, right? Who's in the room? What are they struggling with? How can we be a caring community together? So this model has the preacher as a caregiver, right? That is another way of thinking about how we have responded to conflict through sermons, right? So we've got the prophet, the arbiter, a judge who's going to try and give some clarity about what is needed in the moment. We've got preacher as caregiver, which is more of an orientation toward the care of the people in the room, the healing of the people in the room, fostering that caring community and the compassion among the people who are there. So those two models, arbiter or judge and caregiver, are two models that we have already been given, most of us through our preaching classes, at least in some form. These are pretty traditional models from the 20th century. The prophetic one, of course, goes back farther, but it also comes out of the Black church tradition and liberation theology in new ways in the 20th century. And then the pastor as caregiver is connected to therapeutic models and counseling models. So we have these two orientations, these two models for a preacher and who a preacher is in the preaching moment that have been used to orient toward conflict, right? You might have heard at different times, you just have to tell the truth, you just have to address the conflict, or you just need to care for the people in the room. These are models that we've been given. So I want to propose for you another model, which is relational preaching. This is now the building out of what you've already heard about the nature of conflict and how constructive conflict can be focused on the nature of the relationships we want to build, right? So what are the kinds of relationships we want to build in the family of Christ? And how does preaching help us build those relationships, right? So how is preaching itself demonstrating what those relationships could be or should be, right? This isn't just telling people about relationships, but demonstrating in the sermon, how do we relate well to each other? So I'll give you some examples. So relational preaching helps normalize realities of conflict and tension by speaking openly about them to ask, how do we faithfully respond to the differences this issue brings up? So instead of either the sort of stereotype model of papering over to make everyone feel better, or arbitrating and judging and issuing a proclamation about what should be done, this kind of model of preaching is a model of a sermon where we say together, how are we going to respond to these differences? Because the differences, as we've said, are normal and natural. We have some boundaries around what is constructive and destructive. So how are we going to attend to what is being brought up in this moment? What do we need to learn from this? What are the ways in which these differences are teaching us things that we need to know? So relational preaching encourages opportunities for self-understanding, emotional intelligence, and connection across disagreement and conflict. So if you think about a sermon as something that you as a preacher are delivering as a whole answer to a question, right? This is a slightly different model because it's saying, okay, we're going to learn together about what it means to be in relationship with each other and how we can take this moment of conflict for self-understanding. And maybe as the preacher, you say, here's some things that I've been thinking about this week. What have you been thinking about this week in relationship to this conflict? Where do you come down? Like how did you come to this understanding yourself of what this conflict is about, or where your stake is in it? How have you thought about what matters to you in this conflict, right? And that becomes part of the sermon moment. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, right? Depending on the kind of church you're in. If you're in a small church, you can actually stop the sermon and have people talk, if that's the kind of church you're in. But it can also be that during the week, you've had conversations with people who express different orientations. And I mean people in the congregation who express different orientations to whatever the conflict is. And with their permission, you can weave some of those into the sermon and say, you know, for this person, this question of, I don't know, to take a nice hot topic, transgender affirming care for children matters to me because I'm a doctor and I've seen how it really helps kids who are transgender. And to this person over here, it's really fear. There's a deep fear of what it's going to mean for her own kid if for some reason they go down this road of gender affirming care, and then there's a change later in life that that kid doesn't want to do that anymore, and they've already gone down this road, right? So here are opportunities for thinking about what's invested in this moment in different people in the congregation, and just saying those things out loud in the sermon, and having it be okay that there's not one right answer at the end of the sermon, that it's not all tidied up at the end. Another thing about relational preaching is it resists straw man illustrations and blanket assertions, right? So often we end up hearing sermons where, well, the positive example is that like somebody like Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa or somebody becomes the lifted up person, like Mother Teresa cared for the poor, and so we should all care for the poor. And so you have this sort of hero villain orientation. Or like I just saw the new Indiana Jones movie, and once again, Nazis are still the villain. That's not a spoiler, but I was like, of course they're still the villain, because we can all say Nazis are bad. So we don't have any conflict over the fact that Nazis are bad. So we can make them the like forever villain, right? These are sort of blanket straw man illustrations that don't really help us address actual conflict. So as I was saying before, there are reasons why we all have investment in these conflict issues, right? Like that's why that question that I had in there about where are you in this? What are you thinking about as I'm bringing up these things? It's always personal. It's always about real people. So how in your sermons and your other presentations are you able to not just throw up the obvious hero or the obvious villain, but talk about real people and their complexity, right? So part of this is we're going to stay in relationship with each other because we're going to deal with real and whole people, not these sort of elevated or diminished stereotypes of people. And then finally, relational preaching it broadens our encounters with others, because as preachers, we seek out diverse voices and sources to be the basis of our sermons. We look for different kinds of perspectives, experiences, and ways of thinking. So it's not just I, as a white woman, am going to quote people of color in my sermon, although that is very important, but also my brain operates in these ways. I have a PhD, and so my brain's all scrambled from thinking about academic stuff all the time. So how am I putting things in my sermon that are going to make sense to people who aren't educated in the same way I am, with the same sort of ordered thinking or linear thinking? Or how am I approaching my sermon in a way that really involves the voices of the people in my congregation in the sermon, so that they hear themselves in the sermon? You know, how do I take the conversations I've had with my congregation during the week, or with my staff, or with whoever, and involve them in the sermon, again, with permission, so that I am not the only voice being heard there, because I am only one voice, right? We have authority as preachers. We have been given a mandate for preaching, but that doesn't mean we're the only voice that needs to be heard there. Sometimes the role of the preacher is to bring in those other voices so that they can also be heard, right? So relational preaching is oriented around those diverse ways of thinking. And the function and purpose of relational preaching is to deepen the nature and quality of relationships. So in everything you're putting in your sermon, you're thinking, what does this have to do with the relationships we're trying to build in our congregation? So how am I up in front of these people offering them the kind of relationship orientation that I want to see among them, right? So for example, I said this already, but I'm just going to reiterate. It's not the same thing as getting up and saying, I want all of you to be in good relationship, right? It's demonstrating in the sermon. I'm going to show an appropriate kind of vulnerability. I'm going to show an appropriate kind of openness to different ideas. I'm going to demonstrate the ways in which other voices can be heard besides mine. I'm going to maybe invite other people to participate in ways that show that I value who they are and I want their voice to be heard. And that then becomes a demonstration of the kind of relationships that you want in the congregation. Here are some more specific things. So as you're thinking about what a shift would look like toward relational preaching, again, this is just a model. There are other times for prophetic or pastoral preaching or other forms. This is just a model, but here's the way to think about it. So instead of clarity and simplicity, Mother Teresa, Hitler, which can lead to generalizations and abstractions, focus on honesty, specificity, and reality, right? So what's actually happening? What's the actual situation we're talking about? How can I be specific about this thing in a way that deals with its complexity rather than trying to come up with a hero or villain as my story? How do I not necessarily come to a false platitudinal answer at the end of my sermon? I think all of us really want to present good news in our sermons, and too often good news is just a platitude at the end. God's going to take care of it. God loves us all the time. Put it in God's hands and it'll be fine. These are not wrong things, but they're not necessarily appropriate when we're in conflict, right? Because sometimes it is, God is with us and it's really hard and we don't know the answer yet. And that's the end of the sermon, right? Or we're in the middle of this and we aren't there yet and we're going to keep going. And that's the end of the sermon, right? It's okay to have those things be present and to allow the honesty and specificity and reality of the situation to be in the sermon rather than trying to just come to a simplistic or clarified answer. So as an alternative to authority and answer giving, a lot of times I find that pastors are really stressed out by the fact that they feel like they have to come up with an answer. They have to interpret the scripture and know what it means. They have to say this is right and this is wrong. Focus on our shared vulnerability together. You are a preacher, you are a pastor, you are trained, you have authority, and it doesn't mean you have all the answers. And it's okay to train your congregation to not expect you to have all the answers, right? We're in this together, we're learning together. The congregation is also the priesthood of all believers. So how do we share together in that vulnerability of not always knowing the answers? Now, some members of your congregation are definitely going to want you to have all the answers. And they're going to have to deal with the fact that you are also not a straw man person with all of the answers like at your fingertips, right? This is part of sort of thinking about what the congregation is in a different era when we're not thinking about the preacher as somebody necessarily on high with all the answers and the perfect faith, right? That model has not worked for us. It's not where we're going to end up needing to go. So how are we thinking in terms of shared vulnerability? Again, you have authority as a preacher, you have training as a preacher. It's okay to assert those things too, but in times of conflict, maybe the shared vulnerability is a better trajectory. It also takes the pressure off you from having to know what to do every time in a sermon. So instead of control over what happens, trust of and within the community. Those of us who are Presbyterian, we have a system of governance that trusts, right? That we can do things in community together. So how is your sermon letting go of some of the control or forwarding a particular orientation to a conflict and instead opening it to the community and trusting that the community, if given the opportunity, can work through it together? What are the ways in which a sermon can do that? That's a little bit more amorphous, but it's something to just have in the back of your mind when you're trying to figure out what the word is for the day in a conflict situation. And then instead of unity, which can gloss over difference and make it seem like the specificity of the people are not important, we can focus on interconnectedness. How are you related to me? What do I need from you and what do you need from me? How are we better together even though we're not in agreement? How can we strengthen each other with the gifts that we bring, right? That's different than unity, of us all having to agree. It's okay to disagree and still be interconnected. In fact, it's probably the only way to be, since conflict is going to happen. And then finally, instead of focusing just on maintaining the peace, which can avoid the conflict, we focus on compassion. What's going on here right now? What's happening in this room that we can attend to with compassion, instead of pretending it's not happening, right? We all do not like conflict, and yet if we don't deal with it, it's not going to get better. So how do we attend to it with compassion? All right, couple last thoughts. So in conflict theory, one of the ways in which people think about moving past situations of deep polarization and hurt and brokenness is to think about the shared future. So in the midst of a crisis in 1991 between the Mohawk Nation and the Quebec and Canadian governments, a Mohawk chief reflected that Mohawk tradition requires chiefs to think in terms of 7 generations. The decisions made 7 generations ago affect the Mohawk people today. The decisions made today will affect the next 7 generations. So long-term thinking helps reinforce our shared responsibility and our interdependence. So given that, another frame to bring to your preaching is, even if we cannot come to agreement at this moment in this congregation, in this place, in this city, in this country, what choices can we make now that will help our grandchildren and great-grandchildren live together well? So this is an acknowledgement that some conflicts don't get solved today. They may not get solved in our lifetime, but are there ways that we can come to agreement that we want our grandchildren and great-grandchildren to be able to live together well? And how can we think about that? It's just a frame to put around the kinds of conflicts you might be dealing with. And finally, again, from Carolyn Shrockshank, she's the Mennonite scholar. Imagine how different our conflicts would be if we can move from an "oh dear, how terrible" to "what is God trying to say to us?" So that's your final frame for both relational preaching and preaching in times of conflict. How can you as a preacher think, what is God trying to say to us? And also, how do you bring that question to your congregation in a way that invites them to engage with it and to participate in that conversation with you toward constructive conflict that leads to peace and justice and deep relationship and honesty and vulnerability and all those other things that I said. All right, y'all. That's it. Now you really, really can ask questions or give reflections if you want, because I don't have any more slides. So thoughts, feedback. Are you all just like pondering?
When you were talking about, first of all, thank you so much. This was excellent and super helpful. As you were talking about the relational preaching, I got thinking about how some of that can be done kind of immediately as a pastor, say, begins in a congregation. But some of that also feels like is the thing that you've built up over a year, 2 years, 3 years. I had a pastor I worked with in my first call in South Dakota who had been there maybe 2 months when the Iraq invasion started.
Mm-hmm.
And every sermon dealt with how horrible and unbiblical that was. And it was really hard because people didn't trust him, didn't know him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that was another piece that came to me, and that was how some of that builds up after you've been there a period of time and people kind of know you and know where you're coming from.
Yep.
To speak into those things, which is hard when, like, I have another colleague in the town where I live right now. She started in her congregation a month after George Floyd was murdered, and right in the middle of COVID, and was like, how do you deal with this? So Yeah,
Yep.
so I think the relational also, was a really helpful way to also add in some of those things for me. So thank you.
Yeah, and both of those things are true. I mean, all of you know that you're in a different place when you've been with the community or congregation for a while than when you first start. That's just normal. And they do trust you differently over time, or don't trust you differently if you haven't built those relationships. But the relational nature of the congregation also varies, right? So part of what you're doing that takes time is building up the nature of the community that you're in. You might be coming into a situation where it's already really broken from something that happened before. It's going to take a while for the people in the room to trust each other, let alone to trust you. So that's why this is always contextual and not can't just be blanket statements about a perfect answer for everyone everywhere. But you're totally right about the relational piece. And what are the nature of the relationships we want to build? Do we want to build relationships where we value being right more than we value being in community? There may be times when we have to say that, right? We're not going to let people come in and be destructive in our community because we want to be inclusive, right? But we're also wanting to figure out how to make a community work well together and be effective together as a community and as a caring community. So how do we do those? How do we do all those things? Well, it's complicated and it takes time, but the relational frame can be helpful.
Aimee, you talked about for the constructive conflict encounter to unfold, we need willing participants.
Yeah.
And I think that also holds true in the preaching. And I think this relational preaching is an attempt to sort of bridge the gap between the prophetic and the care, pastoral.
Yeah.
And bring that, makes it open, that willing participants. But even then, I think we may not have a willing ears. Like, for example, I serve a small congregation between Albuquerque and, I don't know, those of you who know where Ghost Ranch is, like there's a mountain called Pedernal that's right behind in a small village with mixed bag in, political thought, theological thoughts. And when I was called, one of the nominating committees, is your preachers going to be biblical or political? And I told the half truth. I said, it's always going to be biblical.
Yeah.
So I see that, and it was sort of very helpful to be able to actually see what I was sort of sensing and feeling and doing, but actually see that as a model presented with those specific pointers. So thank you.
You're welcome.
So I think even you can't help the conflict, the going through that unwilling ears. And I try my best not to shut down the ears. That's why, that's a gauge. How can I keep that tension and the balance in the relational preaching?
Yeah. It's really hard. I mean, I wish I could give you a presentation that was like, if you just use these techniques, it'll be fine. But that isn't really how this works, as we know. Pastoral life isn't like that, and people aren't like that. But I appreciate what you're saying about the willing participants too, because that is a tricky piece of the puzzle. Sometimes you can work really hard and bring people along, and sometimes people just aren't going to be brought along, and then you're in a different kind of scenario. So, but I'm glad the relational preaching feels like a bridge or a piece in between the pastoral and the prophetic. That was my intention, was we've been given these two models. What's another way that we could do this?
Aimee, there's sometimes I think, taking maybe small congregations, that you get a lack of diversity of thought, or it might be just us against all them out there.
Right.
And I think that presents some unique challenges too, just to get the group to actually observe that there might be differences.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
I don't have any good strategies for that off the top of my head, but I do think that generally speaking, that's probably the experience of a lot of, specifically, I assume other denominations too, but specifically Presbyterian pastors. The surveys all say that the Presbyterian pastors are often more moderate to progressive than their congregations, especially the smaller ones. And so that's just a dynamic that is a gap for whatever reason. And so figuring out how to do that well is a challenge, because it's also very specific to the location and what their history has been and who they've had before and where they're getting their information and all that kind of stuff. So I don't have a good answer for that other than to say, yep, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a real challenge.
Yeah, I think they may be very comfortable just ignoring any conflict with the outside world, so to speak, and
Yeah.
that's maybe a little different.
Yeah, and we have this, not just, I mean, the Christian church in general, not Presbyterian specifically, but the Christian church in general has a history of splitting off when we don't like the other part, and then they become not Christian to us, right? So just the idea of saying, hey, we're not the only Christians in the world, like this little pocket that we're in is not the only pocket of Christians that exists, is that alone can be a challenge, right? To remind us that the church down the street, those are also Christians down there. I mean, we just had this in Louisville. There was that big revival at Asbury Seminary down the road. And there was some conversation at Louisville Seminary, which is where my office is, about whether or not we should go like observe it or see what was going on there. But also Louisville Seminary is really progressive and has a very open stance to LGBTQ oriented folks. And Asbury doesn't. So then it was like, well, can we even go down there when they don't share our values around this thing? And I thought, okay, wait a minute, we need to like pause for a second, because are we saying that God is not moving down there because like it's not what we understand, or it's not inclusive in the way we are? On the other hand, for our LGBTQ students to go there to participate or to engage with it, does that feel like oppressive in a way that discounts who they are as people? Like, these are real questions about how do we understand other Christians and their beliefs and orientations toward, our humanity, right? My alma mater, Whitworth College, for a while was really connected to denominations that didn't ordain women. And I thought, y'all, I'm an ordained woman and I feel like my college isn't supporting my ordination because you're taking these stances. So like, how do you sort of balance all those pieces? It's complicated. See, again, don't have good answers for you all. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Aimee, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
And this is just coming from my own church and things happening here right now.
Mhm.
If you're dealing with a conflict where there is, a big elephant in the room and everyone knows about something, but then as a staff person, because of personnel decisions and legal decisions, you can't be as open and specific and honest as you would like to be, but still want to provide that relational preaching.
Mm-hmm.
What advice would you give?
I do think that when relational preaching or orientations toward conflict are rooted in things like honesty and openness, but there are things that you can't say, that becomes a real challenge. And HR stuff and personnel stuff are one of the biggest places where that's hard. My sense is that I don't know your specific scenario, but in a lot of cases, I think we have erred on the side of not saying enough rather than saying too much. So just off the top of my head, what I would say is, in any ways that you can say things that that help to build the trust of the process that happened, whatever it is, to say, these are the steps we took, even if you're not talking specifics, just to sort of reiterate, these are the steps we took, these were the people who were involved, these are the processes we followed. That alone can help build up some of those relationships again, because if people have more trust in the process and in the people who participated, they can kind of let go of maybe some of the specifics of what happened. That doesn't always work, but that's one way to do it. And sometimes, because we're afraid to say too much, we don't say anything. We're just like, oh, we can't talk about it at all. And just talking about the process and what happened, and even to say, this was a process we followed, what could be different next time that would make it feel better within the confines of what's legally required. That can also help to alleviate some of that. Again, it's about what can we say together, and then what can we hear from the folks who are feeling hurt by what happened, or disenchanted by what happened or whatever. So the relational building then becomes about building trust in each other and in the process. And in the process going forward. So if the process was crap, the one that just happened was terrible, maybe taking time to say, okay, the process was a mess. You know, I don't know if you were there for it or if you led it or anything else, but you could also, you know, somebody can say, I wasn't here for it. It wasn't my decision, whatever. So, but we want to talk about it because we want to make sure it doesn't happen again. That can also be a helpful trajectory to just sort of attend to the ways in which we're relating to each other and doing process together as a movement toward building those relationships again. Does that help?
Yes, that's really helpful. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Aimee. It's so wonderful to hear just the flow of all of this. And I find it really helpful for situations relating to conflict, even outside of preaching too. So I found my mind really activated. One thing I wondered about, I was struck by times when people are really eager to say, well, let's find middle ground, or there's got to be a third way, or agree to disagree, those kind of things. Like, what are the hallmarks of when that can be helpful, or is it always a symptom of people trying to fix it or trying to avoid the conflict? Especially when it's conflict around, you know, situation or polarized viewpoints that may not have a lot of middle ground. And
yeah,
so what are your thoughts on that?
This is one place where I find the relational frame helpful when I go back to it, because sometimes even myself, like even without being in conversation with the other person I'm in a relationship with, if I've had a conflict with somebody, there are times when I'm going to have to say, what is the nature of the relationship I want with this person? And I have to just say, I have to let some stuff go because I can't keep having this fight, and we have to get this other work done. And so I'm going to just not focus on this anymore. So that's a kind of response because of the relationship, right? I need to work with this person. I want to figure out how to work with this person. And so I'm going to choose to let go of some of this. But then there's also the thing of, I can't work with this person unless I'm honest. So I'm going to have to say this. I had this situation in my office where I worked with a person for a year who just did not do a good job, and there was no accountability. And I had a really hard time figuring out how to work with the person. And I kept trying to let it go and let it go and let it go. And I couldn't. And in the end, when that person was leaving, I decided that for the sake of having a future relationship with the person, I had to be honest about what the year had been like for me. And so we did that at the end. And my hope is that, you know, in the future, when I see this person somewhere else, we'll have a foundation of some honesty that will allow me to have a real relationship in the future, even though right now it's hard. But if I hadn't said anything, it would always be between us, even if that person didn't know it was there. For me, it would be there. So trying to sort of navigate, like, what is necessary for this relationship to be honest and whole, and then what do I need to sort of let go of and know that that's not just going to be, it's just not going to be part of this relationship for whatever reason. This also happens with, I mean, in much more serious scenarios with people who have addiction issues or mental illness issues, where there's levels of vulnerability that you can't have with somebody who's going through particular kinds of mental illness or particular kinds of addiction issues, and you have to set boundaries. And the relationship is still open on your side. You want to have a relationship with them, but you also have to say, nope, I can't, like, you can't come live at my house anymore. Like, I can't do this thing over and over, or you need to get the treatment you need, and I'm not going to enable you to not do that anymore, whatever the scenario is. So these are just examples of how this relational frame, what kind of relationship do I want to have with this person, is helpful. It also tells you over time, like, you don't have to have the same relationship with everybody, right? You don't have to have a deep, intimate, vulnerable relationship with every colleague or every coworker. But you want to leave the door open so that you're not just writing people off either, right? So does that answer your question? Did I go too far afield? Okay. Just as a side point, oh, go ahead. I was just gonna say, Jessica and I were in the PhD program at Vanderbilt together. And this is maybe the first time she's gotten to hear about what was in my dissertation. And we were writing together. We were like sitting together writing. And so it's fun to have her here so I can like share some of what I was writing about. All right, sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, that's sort of, in some ways it connects, because I was wondering, like, which pastors do you think of as models for this type of relational preaching, like that you studied in your dissertation or that you've worked with closely or just sort of turned to when you need a pastoral word, a relational preaching word to hear good sermons? So I'm just curious on that.
That's interesting. So in terms of homileticians who've written about stuff like this, two that are sort of at the forefront, one of them was my advisor, John McClure, who's written a book called Roundtable Preaching, which is it's an older book. It's like from the late 90s, but it's about how to involve people in your congregation in the sermon writing process. So you sit down with them during the week and talk to them about what they see in the scripture, and then that becomes the sermon, right? Like you don't have to do all that work yourself. You're taking their voices and putting them in the sermon. It has a lot more theory underneath that about the role of the preacher as the convener of conversations, as opposed to the top down, I'm going to have all the answers for you, or I'm going to do all the study for you. So that sort of convening of a round table is a model that exists. There's also a book called, I don't have it on my shelf here. I'm going to forget the name of it. It's an edited volume, so it has a bunch of different people in it. I think it's called Under the Oak Tree, Preaching as Conversation, or something like that. It's definitely Under the Oak Tree. I just can't remember the subtitle of it. But it has a bunch of different perspectives on this kind of thinking around the models of preaching that are different than either the pastoral care model or the prophetic model, and thinking more and more about how do we have multiple voices in the sermon? How are we involving the conversations happening around the church in the sermon? So Under the Oak Tree is another one, just off the top of my head. In terms of preachers, like actual sermons, I have to think about it a little bit more. It's hard because the best ways to do this would be sermons that are in conversation, right? And we don't have good models for that yet. We still are sort of as they say, a park and bark. You're going to stand up in front of people and say all the things. That's sort of our model for preaching still. And most congregations aren't really interested in something different either. They like to just sit and listen, and they don't have to be involved then. They don't have to do anything. Oh my gosh, it's coming to me. Nan. Okay. Come on, brain. She was at Wicker Park Grace in Chicago. Now she's at Forest Chicago. Hang on, it'll come to me. Anyway, there's a woman who used to do a lot of this at Wicker Park Grace Church, and I will pull up her name right now because it's not coming to me, even though it's somebody I know really well, because now I'm middle-aged and I can't remember things. Nanette Sawyer, there it is. Nanette Sawyer is at Fourth. She's done a bunch of stuff around this in her work at Wicker Park Grace when she was doing that new worshiping community. So she would be somebody to check in with. I'm not sure exactly what she's doing now because she's she's at Fourth Chicago, so it's huge. And I'm not sure what her area is, but she would be somebody to ask about what she's done in this, because she's done more of the conversational preaching models. Does that help?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Good. Happy to have more conversation too when I have more resources at hand. Any other questions, thoughts, things that you guys want to ask? We're at our time, so I don't want to keep you longer if you need to be headed off to other things.
I often had a resistance to just completely taking a story off the shelf, and bring it into my preaching. Somehow I felt because I couldn't own it.
Yeah.
So a couple of weeks ago, the gospel was about weeds and wheat, right? And there was a kind of conflict of weeds and weeds, and what people who people think who's which, And instead of illustration, I invited the congregation to just call to mind, take a moment and bring to mind that person that is definitely a weed, and so brought that way. And that was I got the most response. Like everybody thought that preaching was for me, because I invited them to come up with a story. And of course you have to do the follow through. And my church does the outdoor worship in the last Sunday of June, July, August, the summer month. It was a joined by another congregation. So we did, with the other pastor, we did dialogical. So that kind of dialogical, then we talked about kingdom of heaven, invited everybody sort of to do it doesn't work, like you can do it regularly, but just do
Yeah.
that as a kind of, people think of it as a treat,
Yeah.
it happens every so often.
Yeah, that I think what you're pointing to is also just the norms that we're used to. I think if you're in a church for a long time, you could probably shift more over time, but the expectations for sort of traditional preaching are like that's what people expect. So so I'm really glad that you did those other ways of preaching, especially the dialogical. And also just involving the people in the sermon, having them stop and think and answer a question. The week after Christmas this last year, we did that at our church where, because it's a sort of a low Sunday, we had people stop and turn to each other. We were talking, I think, about the flight to Egypt. And so we had people talk and stop and turn and tell one another about a time when they had to leave somewhere and go somewhere else. And just as a sort of engagement with each other, and a story that's fairly simple, right? Everybody is likely to have some story about having gone from one place to another. And it could be really deep. It could be, somebody in the room who's a refugee, or somebody in the room who had to leave some scenario, a bad marriage or something. Or it could be really simple, like I left home and went to college, or I moved downtown from the suburbs, or whatever, right? And so you could engage it at whatever level people were willing to engage, and there wasn't pressure to go deeper, but it also gave people in the pews a chance to talk to each other, but at really low stakes, right? Because everybody has an easy story they can tell, but then they learn something about the person next to them too. So there's a relational connection. Those kinds of things can really be good. So whether you're having them personally reflect for a minute, thinking about who the weeds are in their life, or a particular person who's a weed, or having them actually engage with each other, these are just things that you can weave into your sermons, and then over time they become more normal and not just a treat. Hopefully they can become part of the regular encounter of a sermon. Anything else, friends?
I'll say too, I just think of the relational ideas, especially when you have, like, in contrast to pastoral or prophetic preaching,
Mhm.
like Marilyn Robinson's line about like prophets love the people they chastise or something.
Yeah.
And just like, even if you like sort of broke down all those words and sort of thought about, okay, there's some degree of the arbitrary and judging in the way that chastise, but also what is that love like? How is that sort of brought to bear in a sense of compassion? And
Right.
I guess I don't know if I missed sort of that word explicitly, but like just the nuance and complexity of us. I mean, you sort of suggested with the degrees of difference that we have, or you use someone at the start, like across our differences and across our histories or something.
Yeah.
And just like knowing, again, through your pastoral work as caring for mind, soul, body, like, the different histories of some individuals in the pews as their pastor. You love and want and desire degrees of transformation in their lives, but also in the wider world in which we're called to then be sent out to after worship, and I just sort of like that sort of interplay. And then the humility, right, that you mentioned as pastor too, that we are also as individuals, as pastors, seeking that own transformation and that sort of renewed and growth in our own lives as disciples, as well as the minister at this place. And so it's a journey that we're sort of on together, and sort of inviting us collectively into that work. And so that's the quote, from Robinson that really sort of encapsulates that sort of relational model, I think, for me.
Yeah, and you're also pointing at another important thing, which is thinking about what the pastor's relationship with the congregation is, right?
Mm-hmm.
We aren't separate from them. We are, in a way, we're set apart for particular tasks, but we're struggling with the same things they are. We're not like at a higher level of enlightenment or whatever. At least I'm not. I mean, so how are we, that idea of the prophets loving the people that they're chastising is real, because we're also with them. We also are them, right? Like, we are not, we, at least in Presbyterian land, we are not the mediator between them and God, right? We are among them, and we're all turning to God. So, the relational model can help us think too about what kind of relationship we see the preacher having with the congregation in new ways, right? Different from the preacher as caregiver or preacher as judge or arbiter. Again, both models that are necessary at different times, and models from scripture. But the relational model gives us another rethinking of what the pastor and the preacher is with the congregation. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Uh-huh. All right, friends. Thanks so much for the time. Takako, it was lovely to see you. I'll tell Nolan you were here. So great to see you. And thanks the rest of you for hanging out all the way till 10 minutes after. Yay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.